Hello and welcome to the Vicars Watch Dibley,
the podcast where three priests link our stories with those of a Reverend Geraldine Granger and other TV vicars and vicars from literature and film. I'm Kate.
I'm Jenny.
And I'm Ruthi. This episode we're talking about the classic vicar from Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins, and how he is the worst human being.
No! He's just misunderstood! Don't you dare!
Lovely ladies.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Right, for this particular episode, I should say, Miss Ingram.
Hello.
Indeed.
Pleasure to be with you.
Likewise.
And also you, Miss Banbury Gibbons.
I find the weather's rather nice today.
Terribly pleasant.
The roads have been quite dry.
Shall we take a turn about the room? We're acting very silly today. We're doing something a bit different today, which we'll get to in a moment. But before we do that, how are you all doing?
Yeah, what have we loved this week? Caitlin, why don't you kick us off? What have you loved this week?
I am on leave this week, so I have been having a lovely lazy time. I've been playing computer games, and I've been playing with my dog, and I've been playing with my family. It's been a playing week. It's really nice. Yes. What have you loved this week, Ruthi?
Oh, I'm trying to think. One of the things that's quite exciting at the moment is the park near us, because it's now summer holidays. There's lots of exciting things going on, so there's lots to go and see. So, not to make you all jealous, but there were some dinosaurs the other day.
Gosh, how terrifying!
So, did you know that velociraptors were actually about the size of a big dog?
What? No!
I knew they were small.
It's Hollywood that's messed with us. So my dog Maggie is probably about the size of a velociraptor. I did not know that.
Interesting. I've got someone very close to me in my family who doesn't believe that dinosaurs ever existed.
Oh.
Wow.
So
lot.
Speaking on their behalf, I'd be tempted to say, apparently, there's a theory that their bones were just buried by the Victorians for something to talk about. Velociraptor was great and long. If they do exist, everybody, and you're thinking, what on earth is Jenny going on about? Then
Can we
just
not
let me know.
say if they do exist? What I love about dinosaurs is how much we think they were actually more avian than lizards. So Hollywood has told us that dinosaurs are kind of lizard-like, whereas actually scientists are kind of proposing that they were a bit more bird-like, and they were just
giant
chickens.
angry birds.
Just giant
You
angry
see,
birds.
no one can decide what they're like because maybe they didn't.
Rage.
Jenny, can we not? Can we not?
Are we going to be a conspiracy theory podcast?
Yeah, maybe we will have to be. No, I'm just kidding. I do always challenge this belief by this person in my family, but I think it is hilarious. But it could, well, I don't want to offend anybody out there, but as for me, I shall finish off our What Have We Loved this week. And I've got another outrageous claim. There's have been some birthdays in my family of late, and I would like to claim that I love birthday cake, and I believe that birthday cake tastes the best. Just full stop. There is never a better cake than a birthday cake. So what have I been loving this week? Birthday cake.
Birthday cake.
Do you agree with this?
I see what you mean.
Okay,
It's
controversially,
not a birthday cake.
I don't think I like birthday cake.
Oh,
It's too sweet.
oh my gosh. Really?
I like cake, but I just don't like to eat lots of it. And birthday cake is too sweet and sugary for me.
Already in this episode, we've come up against something, a falling out that we think may well continue into the rest of this episode, because as you may have guessed from our introductions, we are talking about Mr. Collins and Regency gentlemen, clergymen as part of this. And I'm going to say this at the beginning. Me and Kate are really nerdy about this.
So much.
We know our Jane Austen. So Jenny, you have full permission to tell us off When
Thank
actually
you.
just
Finally.
think, this is getting boring, guys. This is really deep nerd. And I'm trying to think of like a Regency phrase that you could use.
I think taking a turn about the room is a good idea.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
we need to just give it a little break. Let's take a turn about the room. Because I'd like to say, for those of you who are listening thinking, oh no, I'm not sure if I'm going to get any of this because I don't know Jane Austen, I haven't met Mr. Collins in either literature or across films or TV, then do not worry, dear listener, for I am with you. I have been doing some research and I did read the books ages ago, but unfortunately I can remember so little. So if you're not a massive fan of Mr. Collins or you're worried that you're not going to get it, don't worry. You can be on Team Jenny, the non-nerd, looking to Kate and Ruthie with jaws aghast as they debate his
because I'm afraid
life.
I have come fully prepared to fight in defence of Mr. Collins, which I think is one of the most controversial Pride and Prejudice opinions out there, because let me tell you, friends, I am deep in Pride and Prejudice. I am so deeply nerdy about Pride and Prejudice. I read Pride and Prejudice variations for fun. People who basically publish fan fiction because it's out of copyright. And it is common in these to cast Mr. Collins as a villain. But let me tell you, I am going to defend Mr. Collins's honour today.
Goodness me.
Outrageous. But for those who are in the know, I think before we started recording, we had a little conversation about what characters we think we would be for a Jane Austen novel. And I think maybe we should just throw that out there straight away so people can make massive judgments.
Great.
Us. I am a Lizzie Bennet. And I know that's really arrogant to say, but I think I am a bit of a Lizzie Bennet in lots of different ways.
I think we would agree.
Which is probably why I think Mr. Collins is a nightmare.
Yeah.
Jenny.
Nemesis. I am definitely, I want to be Eleanor from Sense and Sensibility, but I am Marianne.
You are such a massive Marianne, and it's a lovely thing about you. How about you, Kate? Which Austen heroine do you think you are?
My favourite heroine is Anne from Persuasion. Not the latest adaptation, which we shall not talk about.
No.
It does not exist in my house. I'm probably more and more a Charlotte, though.
That's why you fancy Mr. Collins.
Oi!
Oh, not even fancy, you're defending.
I'm defending
your
him.
husband.
My husband.
Oh, that's really sweet. Oh, he might convince me. I feel like I'm stuck in the middle
Maybe
between.
because Charlotte's life is one I actually quite like the idea of. Like, you wouldn't be allowed to be a vicar in Regency times. Marry the vicar, do the visiting and all the pastoral work,
anyway.
which is
Closest way you're going to get. Yeah,
do.
exactly.
And it's a fairly stable life for her.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And like the book, Charlotte and Lizzie are very different people in lots of ways, but they are very good friends.
Yeah.
And equally, Kate and I are very different people in lots of different ways, but we tolerate each other. you are perfectly tolerable.
More than tolerable, hopefully. Thank you. Before we go too far into discussing the Reverend William Collins, we did just want to briefly mention some of the other clergy in Jane Austen, because there's a lot of clergy in Jane Austen. We have Henry Tilney, Edmund Bertram, Mr. Elton, Mr. Morland, Edward Ferrars, Charles Hayter, and Dr. Grant. They are a common character type in Austen's writing.
And can I ask, is it true that Jane Austen's dad was a clergyman?
Here we go. Here comes my nerd facts. So, yes, Jane Austen's dad was a vicar, and two of her brothers also became clergymen, and she had grandparents who were clergy as well. And I've got a book on the spirituality of Jane Austen, which I've not read properly. It was given to me as an ordination present from my previous boss, who we used to nerd out about Jane Austen with together. And I think there's a couple of interesting things, probably more than a couple, to note about Jane Austen and clergy. So going to give a little teaser without trying to be too nerdy about her. So yeah, Jane Austen grew up around lots of clergy. She knew her stuff, all male clergy, obviously, at this time period, and having siblings of that. So she knows the structures of the church really well because it's her lived experience. I think that's why there are so many clergymen who are part of her characters in her novels, because that's Jane Austen speaks about worlds that she knows, and this is a world that she's very entrenched in. But she's also really critical of the church in lots of different ways as well, which I think is really brilliant in her books. And she is kind of critical about the way that characters like Mr. Collins and Dr. Grant, who I'd completely forgotten about as a clergy person, just are trying to achieve status, and the fact that the church is busy ordaining these people. She does kind of question that a little bit as well. But we don't always see lots of what the clergy are actually doing. We always see the social side of that, because Jane, again, speaks about her world and what she knows. So all the conversations that take place in her books, there is always at least one woman in there, because that's the world that she knows and talks about. So I believe, according to this book, we don't ever see in the book Mr. Collins do a service or anything like that. We don't hear about his prayer life. He reads the Fordyce's sermons, doesn't he, to them, but we don't see that in the book, although we do see it in the films.
We do, however, and we'll get to this, because I mined the book in preparation for this, and I discovered bits I hadn't really noticed before when reading it with a more priestly eye. And we do actually get quite a big hint about how he spends his time in the parish, which we'll get to. I wanted to say, again, before we delve into actually talking about Mr. Collins, the reason why there's so many clergy in this particular social sphere that Jane Austen writes about, it was really common in this Regency period for the third son of a gentleman to go into the church. The first son was the heir, the second would usually go into the army, and then the third son would go into the church. And they were not quite quitting the sphere and going into trade. They still maintained their status almost as gentlemen, but they at the same time were not as well off as they would have been. But also the way that you got ordained back then. It's really interesting for us now, because we go through such a rigorous process to get selected, to be trained, and you go through selection before you do training and before you get ordained. At that point, anyone with a degree could present themselves to a bishop or to a patron and say, I want to become a priest. And because at that time there wasn't the parish system as we understand it, in that the Church of England has stipends and pays clergy to take care of parishes, at that point you had more patrons. So the local lord or lady of the manor has a living to give to someone, so they pay for a priest to be present in their community. And that's relationship. We'll get into patronage and that particular relationship between Mr. Collins and Lady Catherine de Bourgh, which is so highlighted in Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah. So there are lots of differences in how being a clergy person works now as opposed to being a clergyman in Jane Austen's day, but there are some similarities still. So we will get into that later on. And and those who are worried that we're not going to talk about Geraldine Granger as part of this, who are banging on their speakers going, what about Geraldine? Don't worry, we will get into her as well and do a bit of comparison with them later. But we just want to talk about Mr. Collins for a bit.
Yeah. So, Mr. Collins, we are a TV review podcast, sort of. So let's very briefly just outline how many different people have played Mr. Collins that we know of. Pride and Prejudice has been adapted a lot of times. We're not going to be talking about all of those in detail, and we will be referring to the book a little bit as well. But the main adaptations, which we probably know the best, are the BBC 1995 TV series.
The classic.
Absolute classic. My favourite adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, but not my favourite adaptation of Mr. Collins. The second adaptation most people will be familiar with is a 2005 film starring Keira Knightley. The actor who plays Mr. Collins in this is Tom Hollander, who we also know as Adam from Rev.
Yeah.
Then we have Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, released in 2016. That has Matt Smith as Mr. Collins, who we know as the 11th Doctor in Doctor Who. You may also be familiar with Lost in Austen, the BBC series from 2008, which had a young woman from a modern world finding herself transported into Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Collins in that series was played by Guy Henry.
I'm sure throughout this we'll kind of refer to these different versions of Pride and Prejudice. But Jenny, you are not as nerdy about us, so let's take a turn about the room and go to you, Jenny. Which versions of these have you seen, and which kind of Mr. Collins is most familiar to you?
Good question. So I did read the book a long time ago, but unfortunately my brain doesn't retain information or stories very well. So in my research, I did have a look at the kind of some of the key classic clips. Ooh, lots of C's. And K's, about Mr. Collins. And I think, to be honest, I know this is probably a bit like, but the Keira Knightley adaptation of Pride and Prejudice is the one that comes to mind most. And when I was looking back at the Mr. Collins of that kind of, the version of Mr. Collins in that adaptation, I was like, yeah, that's probably the one that comes to mind the most for me.
Let's talk a little bit then about who Mr. Collins is. I want to start with his initial description, his physical description from the book, and then we can think also about how he is in all those adaptations as well. So in the book, this is his description. He is a tall, heavy-looking young man of 5 and 20, so he's 25, and he is grave and stately with formal manners. So he is a serious young man with very formal manners. He's not... We know Elizabeth Bennet really likes the bubbly, lively manner sort of people who are charming, like Wickham and Colonel Fitzwilliam and Bingley. And Mr. Collins is in contrast to that.
That does surprise me a bit, because that's not necessarily the Mr. Collins that we meet in the adaptations. He tends to be sort of small and humble and awkward and sort of like... Do you know what I mean? Sort of like tall and stately and serious.
He's a sort of little toad of a man, isn't he, in the adaptations? And my biggest bone to pick is, in the adaptations, he's cast as significantly older than the character is. So the character is 25. That's really young. For contrast, Mr. Darcy is 28. And I think Bingley, I don't know Bingley's age, but I think he's probably about the same age as Mr. Collins. Elizabeth is 20, for reference. I think the reason that we get Mr. Collins cast as this older, not very attractive, quite short and, like you said, Jenny, blurp, like a... that weird little toady.
Like it's just very awkward.
The reason I think he's cast like that is because we are seeing Mr. Collins through Elizabeth's eyes. In the book, it's easier for them to do that because everything is focalised through Elizabeth. So although it's an all-knowing, omniscient narrator, everything is shown to us through Elizabeth's perception of the world. When it comes to film, it's harder to do that and let us know that we're seeing one person's interpretation of events. And I think the way that they are making it so that we feel about Mr. Collins the way that Elizabeth feels about Mr. Collins, so that we don't have a disconnect of saying, well, actually, he's a nice young man. Why does Elizabeth hate him so much? Is casting him as someone who we're not going to find as attractive or interesting as some of the other male characters.
Where I've just thought about this, and actually, if you do cast him as a 25-year-old man who is tall and quite serious looking, I think there's a lot more danger of him being portrayed or seen as a villain. And by having him shorter and older, he becomes more comedic.
Yeah.
So his kind of desire for status and having a proper wife and all this kind of thing looks more villainous if you have a young, tall, heavy.
But anyway, this is who he is, and he's a serious young man who is very polite and formal, but also he invites himself.
He's not polite.
No. Let's get into this. He is, but his manners don't fit what Elizabeth likes, and I think a lot of it is because he's awkward. He's trying to be polite, and it's not quite working. He has invited himself to make peace with the Bennets, because his father and Mr. Bennet were at odds. Mr. Collins is the heir to Longbourn, and he knows this, and he's come to try and make amends. It's not helped by Mr. Bennet deliberately frustrates events by not preparing his family for Mr. Collins's arrival. Imagine how differently things would have gone if Mr. Bennet had prepared everyone and said, "My heir's coming. Let's be nice to him. Let's make friends with him. He's making a really generous gesture of trying to come and make amends."
But Ruthie, what do you think? You're about to explode.
I can feel rage building up in me about Mr. Collins because all of the way he acts is self-serving. He's making amends because he's going. He says about his father and finding that difficult. But I also think he has an ulterior motive of scouting out the house that he will once have, and because he likes this power and he likes the fact that he has Lady Catherine de Bourgh as his patroness and all this kind of stuff, he wants that kind of status. And I don't know if that comes from a background of like feeling inferior and that kind of thing, but knowing he's the heir and he will go up in the world because of it, and the way he talks, especially in the BBC adaptation, if we're going from film, well, TV in this case, the way he talks is all about wanting to be better. And when he comes to choose a spouse from the Bennet children, he picks the hot one. He sees the most beautiful one. And there is the theory that Mary might have been a better match for Collins in lots of different ways.
Is she the youngest daughter?
She's a middle
Mary's
daughter.
in the middle, and she is very serious as well. And actually, they might have been a good match. Kate's got a finger up at me.
In contrast, like counterpoint, counter argument, and it's not that I disagree with you. I do think Mr. Collins has negative parts to his character, but I said I would be his defender. He picked the eldest. So yes, Jane is the most beautiful, as we're told.
And spoken for, wasn't she?
Yeah, but he didn't know that. So he went, and he has been advised to find a wife from a Bennet. And if we look at this from his perspective, actually it's fairly logical in terms of making sure that the Bennet daughters, those sisters, are provided for, knowing he knows that he, as the heir, is threatening their livelihood. And by marrying one of them, he will be able to secure the safety of all of them once Mr. Bennet dies, because they will all be family. So it is logical for him to approach the eldest daughter, who at that point he doesn't know is spoken for, and isn't spoken for even when Mrs. Bennet then says, "Oh, she'll soon be engaged." Once he finds out that she is likely to be engaged, he then goes to the second eldest daughter, who Mrs. Bennet tells him would be welcoming of his advances.
And she's almost as handsome as Lizzie. No, almost as handsome as
Jane. Yeah,
as Jane. Sorry, Austen fans.
Yes, again, I think you can. For me, I can understand his logic. It's flawed logic, but I can understand it in that kind of social context.
Yeah.
And I think it's really difficult because I'm going to make a very Marianne potential statement here. Love isn't logic. It's not logical. It's feelings based. And so we're like, "Oh, Mr. Collins, what are you doing? Because this so doesn't feel right." But what's also interesting is that from his very logical, doesn't really have feelings, but has many awkward sentiments that he's rehearsed, that's the best that he can do. So you kind of feel sorry for him as well. Hence why I get, Ruthie, your outrage, but also, Caitlin, I understand your need to defend him.
You're so diplomatic.
Do we judgment him? Do we take a judgmental thing and judge him, or do we compassionately go, bless you, Mr. Collins and your logical brain?
He has these two sides. So he has these two sides. He is obsequious and indiscreet.
Oh, can we get a definition of obsequious?
Yeah, obsequious means he is. Well, it's what Mr. Collins is. He sucks up to power.
He's a kiss ass.
I don't like that, I have to say.
He does that.
Yeah, I desperately don't like that.
He's indiscreet. He doesn't guard his words. Like, he says stuff that embarrasses people. He doesn't have that sort of verbal self-control. However, I do think that he is well-meaning and ultimately good-hearted. He is problematic in that because of his time and context, he doesn't respect women, and he doesn't respect the idea that women have minds of their own. But that's how much of that is as a product of his time. Because even Mr. Bennet, some of the stuff he says about his girls... awful.
Yeah, Mr. Bennet is a lot more problematic than we think of him as the lovely doting father, but no.
And how much of Mr. Collins is as a product of his background and his upbringing? So what we know about his background is that his father was illiterate and miserly. Not a nice man and not an educated man. Huge contrast to Mr. Bennet, who is educated and uses his wit as a weapon. We then know that Mr. Collins went to university. You have to go to university to get ordained. And there's a bit in the book where we're talking about why he has such loving feelings towards Lady Catherine. And he talks about how she treated him as any other gentleman. She accepted him, where I think he was probably a bit of an outcast at university as well. So you have this man who's... He's never... Although he is going to inherit an estate, he's not really necessarily been brought up as a gentleman. So he's already in this weird space socially, where he's not really... potentially not accepted on either side of that divide as working class or as gentry.
I'm desperately trying to read Ruthie's face to see if she's hearing what you're saying and resonating, or if the flame, like if her flame is being fanned even
Just
greater.
For a moment, forget that that you're Lizzie Bennet, and think of him as not a romantic interest.
I understand your arguments in lots of different ways, in that, you know, if he's come from that kind of background and him not fitting in either place, I understand the difficulties that come with that, and that isn't an easy place to be in, but it's his desperate social climbing that makes him so unappealing to me, and the way he fawns over people, and all his actions seem to serve those above him, and therefore he isn't necessarily mindful of those who are below him. And part of that comes from just watching the stuff that's how directors have interpreted them. So like in the BBC series, there's that scene where Lady Catherine comes out of church and he like pushes everyone out the way in order to let Lady Catherine through. And I know that's from the TV and that's not necessarily from the book, but you just get that hint from everything that he's doing it all to impress the lady who he really loves.
And it's exactly, and maybe it's because, and I know we're going to come on to this movie, that he gets her worth from her. So he's doing everything he can to value her because she's the one from where he dictates his identity and worth, maybe.
Yeah, where he should get his worth from Jesus.
Well, exactly. We'll get to that. I think insecurity is a key quality of Mr. Collins. And whether we agree with how that's manifested or not, and how he deals with that, I think insecurity is a major quality that he has.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, I to be honest, this is probably like my last input that's interesting, just because I have...
That's
I'm
not
learning
true,
so much.
Jenny.
Oh, very sweet to me. I have to say, the one thing that really stuck out to me when I was doing my research and watching this TV and film adaptation was his lust for expensive things, wealth. He talks about his staircase and, you know, tries to make it sound impressive, but then says, oh, but you should see, you know, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, for she has not one but many staircases. And they're standing in, you know, a room with her at one point, and he whispers to Lizzie, I think, or maybe Charlotte, this rug alone is £300. And like he's absolutely like a moth to a flame. He's so attracted to wealth and splendor and grandness, and I have to say that makes my skin crawl. Like his materialism is something that I think, I'm not sure if I can look past that, even with, I mean, I don't want to be a judgmental who, but I do find that very difficult, especially in his role as clergy. And it leads me to ask the question of, do you think if Mr. Collins were around today, he would pass his BAP?
But the thing is, we don't see enough of Mr. Collins outside, like in his comfort zone, for us to really make any judgment, or him talking about his faith. Like, what we see is an awkward young man out of his comfort zone, and yes, he's not behaving well, but I think we're not seeing the full extent of his character, and we'll get to this in a moment when we talk about the clues we do have about how he spends his time when he is in parish.
I think that's an interesting question, though, about, you know, would these, if we go back to the other gentlemen that we know who are clergy in Austen's novels, I think very few of them would get ordained today, if any of them. Possibly Edmund Bertram.
What about Edward Ferrars?
Edward Ferrars, I don't know. Edmund Bertram, you hear talk more about his interest in the church and what church is about, and that's he's the kind of hero in Mansfield Park, and Fanny Price is the absolute worst, but that's probably because I'm a Lizzie. Whether you kind of don't know enough about the others, but I think lots of them have kind of taken the route because they are the second son or third son, and so I think, yeah, it's a very different world, and I don't think lots of them would be ordained.
Let's be honest.
The women might have been, though. Yeah,
exactly. Let's be honest. They're not gotten into this because they love the Lord and want to serve the people. Like, that is not...
It's duty.
If we're basing it on that standard, no, Mr. Collins would not pass BAP. Because he's just not talking about that. But then that wasn't the culture of the clergy that we see in Austen. I'm not going to say that no clergy at the time did that, but anyway, the motivation is security. Mr. Collins' motivation was probably security, knowing that he was going to inherit land, so he needed to sort of still move in this sphere. He probably couldn't go into law. He's not a very, very intelligent man that we know. He went into the church.
Because that's where the unintelligent people go.
Let's talk about... I want to talk about how Mr. Collins is in parish and what he sees his duties as being. And I'm afraid I am drawing from a book on this. I'm not quite sure it's touched very much at all in the adaptations. I think sometimes... You see him
do a service in the film, the 2005 adaptation, where he accidentally talks about intercourse instead of the intercourse.
So at the Netherfield Ball, which is one of those key scenes in Pride and Prejudice, and this is one of the times I think we do see it in the adaptations. After eating, there's an opportunity for young ladies to exhibit. Mary plays a piano and...
Not like that, Jenny.
Not like that, Jenny. To exhibit their talents and show what kind of company they'd be in the evening.
Oh my goodness.
And basically to show off their talents in terms of playing piano or singing. Mr. Collins stands up and gives a little bit of a speech about how he would like to be allowed to sing in definitely the BBC version of this, it's really played to show how unlikable he is, how badly he reads a room, and just how awkward he is. But what he does say in his speech, his extended speech, is why he thinks it's okay for clergy to like music. He's justifying that he has interests outside of the dour and formal and sombre lifestyle that some people might expect clergy should have. And he talks about...
That's still true.
Yes, still very true.
He talks about how it's important for a clergyman to spend time agreeing tithes, pleasing his patron, writing his own sermons, and then he also has to stretch the rest of his time to his parish duties and for the care and improvement of his dwelling, that he should have attentive and conciliatory manners to everyone, and especially to those who he owes preferment, and he should also testify respect to the family.
See, that's lovely in principle, but a lot of that will be serving to Lady Catherine, won't it? Because she'll pay his salary. So he owes lots of time to the patron, who in this case is Lady Catherine. Improving his own dwelling, that's making his house nice. The families that he should be concerned with, probably the de Burghs.
But then, I'm going to continue us through the journey of the book. Later on, once Elizabeth visits Hunsford, which is where his vicarage is, that's his parish, he leads them on a tour through his parish. And Elizabeth is deeply frustrated with this. She doesn't like that she's being guided around. So we see this very much coloured through her lenses. But he leads the way through every walk and crosswalk in his parish. He could number the fields in every direction and could tell how many trees there were in the most distant clump. This tells us that he has spent his time in his parish. He knows every square centimetre of that land, and he sings its praises. And Lizzie doesn't like this because he goes on in his usual way. You know, he over-praises, but he knows it. And then in chapter 20, and then in chapter 30, a little bit later, Elizabeth is reflecting on the fact that Mr. Collins seems to spend a lot of time going to Rosings, and she doesn't understand it, except Charlotte thinks it's necessary too. And she thinks that it is to spend time giving obeisance to Lady Catherine de Bourgh. But there's also a hint. He says he takes the needs of all the cottages to his patron. The minutest of concerns are carried to her. And on one hand, this could be seen as meddling, and he's not keeping confidentiality. But at the same time, he is taking concerns to a person who has the power to improve the lives of those people. So if a cottage needs mending, it's Lady Catherine who is the one who's meant to mend it. And so it's the duty...
But that's not his job.
No, but it's the duty of the landed gentry to care for their tenants. That's one of the big ticks. That's one of the big positives of Mr. Darcy. So is Mr. Collins is clearly spending enough time with the people in the cottages to let Lady Catherine know what needs to be done to improve their lives.
But that's the role of the steward. So Lady Catherine would have a steward to care for her land, and that would be his job. Would be his job to know what's going on with the cottages. Now, if he's not doing that properly, and therefore Collins is stepping in and saying, actually this person's really struggling, they need their house built, and fair enough. If he's doing it for gossip, then that's a different thing. And I wonder if he's slightly using it as an excuse to go to Rosings Park more than necessary.
We're not told either way, except through Elizabeth's prejudice. Elizabeth does not like Mr. Collins, therefore anything he does is bad.
But the thing is, as well, is you know a person by their actions. And when you were describing his day-to-day Kate, and
Catherine.
how Catherine and his manner.
So you're not a Catherine.
I'm not a Catherine.
You are for a second there. Sorry about that. Were for a second there. That's all very well and good if your mindset is all about what your cottage looks like here on earth. But surely the job of the vicar is to consistently and constantly point people to what's to come. And again, this brings us back to his obsession of what is here and what is now, and like the wealth and the grandeur of things. Which does haunt me a little bit, and why I think maybe he possibly wouldn't pass the 9 criteria, which I know we've already spoken about.
But you're right. I think, for me, where I land is, I think Mr. Collins is not a bad man. I think he's a good man with a good heart at his core, but we'll get to this. I think he is insecure, and I also think he's not a very spiritual man.
Which is really the only thing that matters.
Yeah, which is
it could be argued.
But then
like,
you could also make the argument about Geraldine Granger.
How does this?
Very rarely see her pray or telling people about Jesus. We see it a bit, but that's not the focus of the Vicar of Dibley.
Well, that's true. I mean, it couldn't be, I suppose, could it? Otherwise, people wouldn't watch it.
You've said it, that Geraldine doesn't pray that much.
It is one of the things, isn't it, with in comparison to Jane Austen and Vicar of Dibley, is that we see the social side a lot more than the kind of spiritual side in lots of ways. It is there, and it's, hinted at in the text, and we do see services that Geraldine does, and we do see her often in times of crisis praying, or when she really, really fancies someone, she turns to the Lord. But you do see that background side a lot more.
Agree. And also what I would say is, for some people, as the vicar, you are, now for better or for worse, I believe this could be true, that you represent something of God very clearly to your parishioners. And although we might not always see the interior life of Geraldine Granger, the way she is, now I know sometimes she's not perfect, and we've talked a little bit about how she can be a bit harsh with Alice occasionally, but actually the way that she is tells of God's warmth and love and welcome and acceptance. And like I say, I don't get that vibe from Mr. Collins, which makes me feel uncharitable towards defending him as a priest, as a vicar, because with Geraldine you get the warmth and the welcome and the love of God, and with Mr. Collins you don't.
How much of that is Elizabeth Bennet? And I keep bringing us back to this, but we are limited in our knowledge of Mr. Collins by what Elizabeth Bennet observes and what she thinks of him. Does Elizabeth Bennet follow him to church? Does she spend time with him in his study as he's preparing his sermons? Does she actually listen when he speaks?
Which is a point of credit to Mr. Collins, is that he's writing his own, because it was very common for, there were people who would write sermons, and it would be more often normal than not to just read someone else's sermons from a book. So he is doing that thinking. And I think, in defence of Lizzie, she sees the way that he serves her friend, and so sees the advantages that Charlotte gets by being married to him, and now she has status and she has a place in the household, and she's able to do things that she wasn't able to do at home, and sees that he is attentive to her and does care for her in his own unique way. So I think she does start to see some of the positives in Collins through the way he acts towards her friend, though she may still think him a ridiculous.
What really sold me on Mr. Collins was that little passage about him showing them around his parish and knowing it so intimately. I wish I knew my parish that intimately, that I could say, but then I've done that. Like Ruthi, when Ruthi came to visit me and we went on a walk around my parish, and I said, oh, so-and-so lives in that house and this is about this place. And there's something about, you've spent so much time walking your parish that you know who lives where and what everything is.
I think it's worth pointing out, though, that the way we would understand a parish now is very different to how it would have been then. So a parish for Mr. Collins might be 30 houses. So that's just 30 families that he needs to know. Whereas, I don't know if you two know off the top of your head the number of people in your parishes.
Around 6,000 for us.
It's a heck of a lot more than 30 families. And so his intimate knowledge of his parish is very commendable. I like that a lot. But he is working on a lot smaller scale than we are.
So is Geraldine Granger.
Yeah, so is Jerry. That's a very good point. She is working with a village. Yeah.
Could I just check, though, on the topic of Mr. Collins and his parish? Are you absolutely sure, and I don't know because I haven't read the book for 100 years, are you absolutely sure that he's not displaying the parish and its glory so that he looks great because he's the incumbent there?
I think there's a little bit of it that he's showing off to Lizzie in a look at the lovely prizes you could have won. If you'd married me, you would have got all this kind of thing. That's how I interpret it. I disagree. Whereas Kate does not.
The book is being opened. I think we're going to get some.
He's actually, when he says his goodbyes to Elizabeth, he says, I know that Hunsford must seem extremely dull to a young lady like yourself. There's little to tempt anyone to our humble abode, but the favour of your company has been much felt. He really is very thankful that she's visited, and particularly thankful for Charlotte.
Yes.
He says, you know, he almost starts saying about he is still a little bit hurt by the fact that Lizzie turned him down, and that's obvious. But he says, on this point, I'll be silent. Only let me assure you, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that I can from my heart most cordially wish you equal felicity in marriage.
Which, he says that bit in the BBC adaptation and then does the really creepy way that Charlotte, and she's like, what are you doing?
But that's that adaptation. And I'll admit, I was rereading specifically looking for Mr. Collins and therefore separating myself from Elizabeth. So when you do that, it's really jarring to suddenly have Elizabeth's little asides about how she wouldn't enjoy this, and how could Charlotte possibly enjoy this? And Charlotte must be so happy when Mr. Collins disappears.
But she is. That's how it's played in the TV and the films.
That's how it's played in the films, but that's not clear in the book. Charlotte never says that. That's just Elizabeth's perception of things. But we're not talking about Mr. Collins as a romantic interest. I think when I was reading it, I got the impression that he's just doing what any of us would do if someone visited. We're showing them around.
Yes, but I would say, and then, he refers to his humble abode and then talks about the wonderful things that are part of it. So the humbleness does not seem quite so humble. So when I talk about my house here, I'm very fortunate to live in a bigger house than I would ever expect to. And so that's how I talk about my house. I would never go and say, oh, look at my big fancy house. Isn't it amazing? Haven't I done well? I would say, you know, this is a gift and it's amazing. I don't think
what he does,
he talks about his humble abode and then shows all the different bedrooms.
This is later. This is him saying goodbye. And what he does do is he plays up his connection to Lady Catherine. And we see this throughout. When he's showing around the house, he's saying, Lady Catherine suggested we did X, Y, and Z. So I want us to get to, because we're dancing around this. So I want to get to one of the themes I want us to discuss, which is imposter syndrome. I am convinced, having reapproached Mr. Collins, that he has imposter syndrome. Now, for those of you who don't know, imposter syndrome, particularly for clergy, is when you feel like an imposter. When you feel like you aren't everything that you should be for your job, that you have been given this authority that you didn't earn, and you feel a lack of confidence, you feel insecure. I think Mr. Collins has this. He's young. He has a disadvantaged background. This job has fallen in his lap. We're told it's very much by coincidence that he was recommended to Lady Catherine. And it's a secure, quite a nice job, quite a nice place. He's in a nice house. He's got a patroness who is holding his hand quite a lot. And yes, we wouldn't like how controlling she is and how involved she is. But for someone who's not sure of their job, he hasn't received specific training on how to be a priest. I think...
But none of them do they?
None of them do, but I think he has...
I hadn't thought of that.
Imposter syndrome. And that's why he keeps making appeals to authority.
There's the matter of confidence as well, isn't there? That I think he is lacking in confidence in so many different ways. And Geraldine has lots of confidence, but also speaks when she hasn't got that confidence. So I think Colin doesn't have the confidence, but acts like he does in lots of different situations. And so, you know, he doesn't think he is a catch in marriage, but talks about how he's a catch in marriage, and you know, you might not get an offer as good as this kind of thing. And you know, look at Charlotte, what she's got. She's done really well, hasn't she?
He's trying to justify himself.
Yeah. Whereas Geraldine is very kind of self-confident in lots of ways, and she knows who she is. She knows that she's a beautiful babe of God with a delicious bob and a magnificent bosom.
Yeah.
And all that kind of thing. But she also, there are times where she isn't confident, and she admits to that sometimes. So, like the episode where Mrs. Cropley dies, where she has that moment of vulnerability before going in, knowing that she hasn't done this before, and needs to kind of lean on her parishioners for that. And there's different points that she does lean on the parish council for various different things. So I think, that Geraldine comes from a background where she's very different to the people around her when she first arrives in Dibley, but she learns to listen to them and grows in confidence from there.
I would say the key contrast with how they both deal with lack of confidence when they have it is that Mr. Collins makes appeals to authority. So he makes lots of references to Lady Catherine because she's the authority. It should be God, obviously. But he makes appeals to authority. He gains his legitimacy through relation to Lady Catherine. And he over-apologises. He does notice when he steps wrong, and then he over-apologises, which we do see, and that's told to us explicitly. Geraldine uses humour.
Yeah. Yeah. And they are both characters that are played for comedy a lot of the time, in various different situations.
Have either of you dealt with imposter syndrome?
All the time. All the time. I think especially I started teaching on a course about growing your church called Leading Your Church into Growth, which is a fantastic course. Would recommend it highly to any clergy.
Yes.
I started teaching on that from when I was about 19, 20. Now, I was working in a church that was growing, and I was involved in that. But for a long time, and I still do whenever I teach on that, and I still do when I'm teaching in my job, just stand there and think people are going, well, she's a young woman, she hasn't got a clue what she's doing. When I wasn't ordained, it was even worse, because I thought they'd go, well, she's not got a collar, so she doesn't know what it's like. And would just stand in a room and think people are judging me. And I still feel that every time I stand up to do that, even though I have the authority, I do know what I'm talking about in lots of different things. I stand there and go, I haven't got a clue. And these people know it.
Yeah.
It's tough. I feel like I definitely have identified it in my ministry. So I was ordained in 2016. So after the last, how many years is that? 6 years, 6.5 years. I definitely have thought, oh, I'm feeling a certain way. And I've thought really like, I've been like, why am I feeling like this? And I've noticed it probably is feeling like a bit of an imposter, not feeling like you have the right to be in the room. I think that is definitely something I have contended with. But I also often I like just imagining being at the front of church. There's two things. The first thing is I don't really know what I'm doing, but I absolutely know that God is real, that God loves these people. And so I will offer the little that I have to offer.
Oh,
and
Jenny.
the second, I'm sorry, I was closing my eyes to really properly think about how I felt at the front of church. But the other thing is like the awe of being there. Like I'm imagining at the moment, like being behind the at the altar for Holy Communion. And one of the prayers we often pray before we start our services at my church is like, and something we say as part of the Eucharistic prayer is like, almost, thank you, God, that we can stand in your presence and serve you. And it's like, I know that I have such little to give, but I really desperately know and desperately believe about a God who has, you know, a lot to give. And if all of us can group together and channel that, or if just one or two of us can stand at the front and, you know, direct people into knowing that, then God is, oh my goodness, totally going to use that. And so it excites me that the little I have, I mean, obviously, kingdom economy, it's all topsy-turvy, that God will use that. And so I would like to take this moment to encourage you, dear listener, if you're thinking like, oh, I'd love to do something in my church, or I'd love to be active, but like Ruthi, like me, probably like Kate, and you think, well, what am I, you know, what am I about? What have I got to offer? Is there anything I could actually do? The answer is absolutely yes. And yeah, to listen out for calling, because actually it's God who equips us. And yeah, at every age, every season of life, I think that's something that's always on offer for us.
Yeah.
Well, that's a little rant there, sorry.
No,
it's
beautiful.
lovely.
I think the imposter syndrome stuff can often come from being a young woman up front as well, and feeling like this is a very older male dominated space, and therefore feeling that you need to make a mark and get everything right because you're kind of apologising for being there yourself. I don't know, do you agree, Kate?
I think for me, my imposter syndrome is less about the kind of upfront church stuff, because I've been doing that since I was like 15. Like, even making the argument I'm a young woman, like I've been doing it for like over 15 years. Like, I've got experience. For me, the imposter syndrome kicks in when I'm chairing PCC, when I'm doing the more legal side of things, kind of on the governance, where I think you're looking to me to make this decision for you, but you're the ones who have the expertise in this parish. You've got more experience here.
Yeah.
I don't feel there's things like when I've been asked to mediate a conflict, and I had to suddenly do a lot of studying to work out what I'm supposed to be doing because I didn't have the expertise in that particular area. And I was thinking, I'm not equipped for this. I don't feel... I heard someone reflected to me recently that when you move from curacy to being a rector or an incumbent or a priest in charge, it's like moving from being an intern to like...
CEO.
Or from a newly qualified teacher to head teacher. Yeah. And there's such a jump in authority and what's expected of you to know how to do.
Definitely.
And for me, that's where my imposter syndrome kicks in, because I think I don't have the experience for this side of things.
It's so tough, isn't it? Because there is, maybe it can be that there is expectations of ourselves or of others onto us that we know what we're doing. But actually, I think this is the way that God designed humans. Now, this is a big statement, could be wrong, but actually we need each other. And I love that the way that the leadership of the church works is the vicar never makes a decision on her or his own, but actually you are a part of the senior leadership with your PCC because you expect that their skills and their strengths will be put to use. And I think that, when you said, Kate, I don't feel equipped, I was like, oh my goodness, every single day, all the way through the day, I feel like that. But that's what keeps me constantly going, okay, God, I really need you now. Like, please, Holy Spirit, please speak on my behalf. Please, Holy Spirit, please comfort this person. And I say that because I was even praying that today, and I still do every time I do a funeral. I was talking to somebody this morning about this, and she said, how on earth do you do it? How do you do a funeral? And I was like, I honestly don't know. I literally just have to pray my face off, because you both know I'm soft as anything. I weep all the time. And if I'm with other people who are feeling sad, I sponge it all up and I want to cry as well. And I never feel equipped to do anything. But I think that's it's that whole thing of, well, when we are at your weakest, that's when God is at God's strongest. And just that whole trying to fully rely on God and position our life to be like, hey, God, this has to be you because I can't, is like one of the things, that's probably the only reason why I'm still here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so then bringing things back to Mr. Collins, I think what we see is a really unhealthy way of dealing with imposter syndrome, if he has it.
Yeah.
But because what he does is he, like you said, he becomes materialistic and he becomes obsequious. He makes these big appeals to the authority and borrows the authority of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in an unhealthy way, in a way that isn't pleasant for anyone else. And he's making his insecurity into a disaster when he should be relying on the people around him and trusting other people, and particularly relying on God. And I think what we see, and I think actually most adaptations show this, is that once Mr. Collins marries Charlotte, he does calm down. Yeah. And he starts to improve. And I think what we see is him starting to rely on Charlotte rather than Lady Catherine.
Interesting.
To settle him. And that's much better because Charlotte actually knows him and actually spends time with him. And is actually a fairly sensible woman.
He all seems busy and out.
Anyway, we'll not get into that debate again. So yeah, I wanted to talk about imposter syndrome because it was something that was new to me in terms of putting that into his character as I was reading it.
Yeah. It's interesting that as well, what you've talked about in that is his reliance on Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is his patron, which is something we wanted to talk about as well, what patrons do. So it's not as common a practice now of having a individual person be a patron to a church. More often it's a diocese or it might be a group or something like that, but they do still exist, and it's often in rural communities. Have either of you got a person who's a patron to your church?
Yes. One of my patrons for one of my parishes is a Prime Minister.
Wow.
However, we are in...
Poor you.
Yeah, we are in suspension at the moment, which means... that instead of incumbent, I'm a priest in charge, just because there's restructuring going on in Medinery. So the patronage is technically suspended. We'll not get into that. It's boring, it's legal, I don't quite understand it. But yes, technically, I have a patron in one of my parishes.
And part of the role is kind of that they oversee and look after the church and the bill, and you as a priest, and make sure that you're doing your job properly. So I've got friends who've had patrons who are people, and as opposed to institutions, and so they'd meet with them to just talk things through, and sometimes they're not people who are connected to the church in any way other than throwing money at it, and so don't necessarily have that faith, but other times they are people who are and would engage with it. And so Collins has got his patroness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who seems to be interested in what's going on around, and Mr. Collins provides that. And it's not explicitly said, but it's slightly implied that David Horton is that to Geraldine, or even if he isn't a patron,
maybe historically
he takes that role, doesn't he, of kind of overseeing the church in a different way.
Well, it was my supposition for trying to work out how Geraldine only has one parish and why this tiny village of Dibley has its own priest. And the only way I can make that work in actual real world church logic is that it's a patronage. And there are a few around still where it's working like this, where there is a landed gentry type person who is paying for the living. Is exceptionally rare now. But it's interesting because we have this dynamic of you need to keep the person who is paying for you sweet. Do you remember, I don't know if you were part of this lecture at Cranmer Hall where we trained, we had someone come who had I don't know if it was an actual patronage or it was a sort of historical, this person used to be a patron, where there was a lady of the manor who he said it felt like spiritual warfare, and he told this horrible story about going to tea with her and her essentially being an enemy and not liking him, and not liking what he was doing in the parish. That's the nightmare scenario where the person who has a financial power isn't in opposition to you. But then you also have those people in parish who are patrons in other ways, in that they take you specifically under their wing in good ways sometimes. They see, particularly if you're young and single, they want to look after you and protect you, and they'll sort of lend you some of their standing in the community, as it were, by vouching for you, for good or for bad. Like,
oh my goodness.
I think there's other ways to interpret patronage as well.
I have to say, I am freaking out about this idea because as an absolutely massive people pleaser, I suddenly am terrified. If I ever am in a parish in the future with a patron, I'm scared that I would become a Mr. Collins. There, I said it. I feel like I've entered into the confessional. I didn't even know I needed to, but I think I would. Like, you know, for them to. Oh goodness, it raises a huge dilemma. To be fair, now I'm starting to feel more compassion for Mr. Collins.
I'm a huge people pleaser, and I think this is why I have so much compassion for Mr. Collins, because I over apologise when I've upset someone.
Caitlin, you are not Mr. Collins.
I'm not, but
you are. Before you compare yourself, you are sunshine and delight and kindness and genuineness. He is squirmy wormy.
But the problem is, I think I see him as someone I could have become. Like, I remember when I first started. I said I started leading stuff when I was 15. I did not have any sort of sense of authority at that point. When I started leading things, I sort of became quite bossy. And I remember a really devastating moment when I was 17, where someone from that youth group came to me and said, "Yeah, we think you're full of yourself and you think you're better than us." That was, I mean, a huge turning point for me, because I'd never had that intention. But the way that I tried to create authority for myself obviously gave that impression. So I think Mr. Collins he's so easy to become if you are insecure.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
And Lady Catherine has taken him under her wing. If we're reading charitably, you know, this relationship. And actually, one of the reasons I really like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is that they actually really frame Lady Catherine in a really positive light.
She's a badass. She's a badass, isn't she?
And I think, you know, she takes him under his wing and she takes a risk on him. And if you're being uncharitable and pessimistic, then she's picked someone who she knows she can control. If you're being charitable, then actually she's taken a risk on someone and she's being really supportive and encouraging. And it's probably actually somewhere in the middle ground.
Interesting.
Neither saint nor sinner. Mr. Collins is totally reliant on Lady Catherine being pleased with him. His whole living, his whole stability, Charlotte's living as well, and her safety and ability to even be fed, right? At the end of Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth and Darcy get engaged, we see that go wrong for Mr. Collins and Charlotte. Because when they get engaged, when Elizabeth and Darcy get engaged, and Charlotte is supportive because Elizabeth is her friend, Charlotte and Mr. Collins have to go and stay with Charlotte's family. They have to escape Hunsford and escape Lady Catherine's displeasure.
But they've done it the other way earlier, haven't they? Where he comes and relays Lady Catherine's displeasure about the engagement of Lydia and Mr. Wickham, and comes and censures the girls on there's the line about it would have been better if their sister had died as opposed to have such a atrocious match. So yeah, this is why patronages can be dangerous.
My feet are getting itchy for a turn about the room.
Sorry.
I've wanted to say that this whole episode.
So one last theme I'd like to briefly touch on, briefly discuss while we're thinking about Mr. Collins, is that of clericalism or clergy exceptionalism. Now, let me explain what I mean. Mr. Collins makes it clear that he thinks clergy follow different social rules to everyone else. Elizabeth finds this embarrassing because he goes and introduces himself to Mr. Darcy, and he sees this as Mr. Collins says he thinks that it's his duty because he knows Mr. Darcy's aunt, and he feels like he needs to go and say hello and say, last time I met your aunt, she was in good health. Separating this from Elizabeth's embarrassment and Mr. Collins's pomposity, what do we think about
Great word.
this? Do we think that clergy can and should follow different social rules to everyone else? And particularly in that sense of, I think I agree, not that he thinks clergy have the highest rank in the kingdom, and that's reasoning. I think that's nonsense.
No.
But I do think that we do operate across social boundaries. And I know, at events, I've gone and introduced myself to the personage in the room. I haven't, found someone to introduce me. I've gone up and said, hi, I'm the local vicar. I'm Kate. And I think, actually, Mr. Collins, as much as Mr. Darcy doesn't like it, as much as Elizabeth doesn't like it, I think he's justified in going and saying, hey, I know your aunt. She's my patroness. She's well. What do you think? Have you ever done that sort of thing where you've gone and introduced yourself to someone where you felt like you've needed to break the social conventions in that way?
I think a lot of our jobs is introducing ourselves to people and being amongst people and getting to know them and just saying, hi, I'm Rev so-and-so, I'm Vicar of here, what are you guys up to? And actually a lot of your role is chatting to people, isn't it? Getting to know them. And I think, especially in Collins's case, I know it's different because of societal norms at that time. In that case where he does go and say hello to Mr. Darcy, I think that makes sense because that familial connection. But I have just thought now, why doesn't Lizzie introduce them? Is she able to, as a woman, introduce someone to someone else, or is she not because she's a girl? Or I know she's embarrassed by him and doesn't want to introduce him to Mr. Darcy.
He will consider it an impertinence.
But was she someone who could have solved some of the problems in that by making that introduction, even though she finds Mr. Collins embarrassing and therefore doesn't want to be associated with him?
I think she could have, but she doesn't want to be associated with Mr. Collins, and she doesn't want to be associated with Mr. Darcy either at that point.
Yeah.
So
she changes her mind.
She changes her mind, but yeah, someone else could have introduced Collins to Darcy.
We do work in kind of different ways socially as well, and we do end up sometimes hobnobbing with the bigwigs in various different situations, and I think how you approach it is very different. If you see this as a person and go, yeah, it's just another normal person, they just happen to have quite a fancy job title or quite a lot of money and things like that, your attitude towards them needs to be different. But I think the acting thing as well, I think you definitely act different in the world when you're clergy, and I think that's evidenced when clergy get together and it's just clergy, and sometimes we can get a little bit riotous.
Yeah,
riotous.
I think where Mr. Collins goes wrong, and I think where actually owning up, I think clergy, we can fall into this sometimes, is where the shadow side of feeling like we can and should cross social boundaries, that we should kind of greet everyone and be on a level with everyone, it's then you can fall into, and this is what Mr. Collins does, thinking you are part of those higher circles and you're part of that higher status in your community.
It makes me cringe so much. I'm literally dying over here. I think because for me, I think if there is a difference, if there is being different to clergy, it should be that you are the one that looks the lowest in the room. Like you are the servant. You've got your towel ready to wash the feet.
Yeah.
Sorry to be so Jesus-y. Do you know what I mean? You're like, oh yeah, of course you should be like Jesus. But do you know what I mean? If you're going to be different, and this whole idea of like schmoozing and I find it makes my insides go wiggly, like squirmy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
but I do recognise it. I do recognise it, and I think it's one of the things that actually, if you are in a position where you could be put on a pedestal, or you could be cherished,
celebrity,
exactly, then I just think every opportunity to reteach people about what that looks like.
Yeah, the point of clergy is that if we have power, we're meant to use that power to help people who don't have power and to serve everyone. And it's the whole Jesus was a servant king. That's the model we're meant to follow. That's what authority is meant to be. It's meant to be serving others. So when you go and introduce yourself to the most powerful person in the room, you're doing it not so that you can be hobnobbing, but so that you have those connections, so that if, for example, there's a problem that person has the power to solve, you can bring it to them. So, I mean, if we're looking back to Lady Catherine, it's Mr. Collins saying, your tenants aren't being looked after, and so I'm telling you that so that you need to make a change. Well, he wouldn't do that so directly, and I doubt he ever did quite that way. But that's the sort of relationship you want to see, is saying, you have the power to make the change, and I'm going to convince you to make that change through our relationship.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand that way of working. I'm just thinking about in my life at the moment. I'm thinking if there was a powerful person in the room, I almost certainly wouldn't go and introduce myself to them, because I'd be so afraid of a Love Actually situation between Hugh Grant Prime Minister and Martine McClutchan as her lovely character. I just had a premonition I was going to fluff. I don't think I would go and introduce myself to somebody, because I would almost certainly put my foot in it. My words don't come out well at the best of times, let alone if there was a high pressure situation or I was feeling a little flustered.
I have to say, there was one occasion where I met isn't even the right word. I was briefly in close proximity to Archbishop Justin Welby.
Oh my gosh, I'm getting sweaty just thinking of it.
I know. I thought maybe it would be good to just say hello and that kind of thing, but also was very aware that, oh goodness me, this is really quite an important person, and they wanted to speak to the person that I was talking to, and I probably should just gently retire from this conversation in order to
slow step back.
Like that the gif of Homer Simpson just going back into a hedge. Felt a bit like that. I
know, what happened?
Like nothing.
Oh. Did you slope back into the hedge?
I did kind of slightly slope back, but then equally, and this is in danger of me sounding a bit like Lady Catherine de Bourgh as my patroness, I'm connected with Bishop Thorpe Palace and the Archbishop of York, so have seen Archbishop Stephen on a regular basis and had a nice chat with him and had lunch and talked about the football and that kind of
Very
thing.
Cool.
So, it's funny, isn't it? You end up in these different situations.
So yeah, it's something about your scope of authority or the scope of your ministry. So does it make sense in this situation for me to be introducing myself and saying who I am? It makes sense in my parishes to go up to the people who own the big farms when there's these big events and they're hosting one of these big events and say, hi, I'm the local vicar. Because I'm their vicar, and it's good to have that connection, that they know who I am, and so that hopefully we can work together in the future for the betterment of a parish. However, if I was visiting family, say I was visiting my sister in Scotland, and we went to something in their village, and the lord of their manor was there, it would make no sense whatsoever for me to go and introduce them to myself to them and say, hi, I'm a vicar down in Herefordshire.
That is the difference.
I'm Lucy's sister. I mean, maybe if I knew someone that person knew, and it's like, oh hi,
and
I'm so and so.
Very well
friend.
when I left them 3 days ago.
Exactly. Like, that's why I'm not as offended by Mr. Collins coming up to Mr. Darcy, because there is a link there, a logical link of why he would go and say,
yes,
hi, I know your aunt. And
maybe he does really love her as well. He's keen to make contact so he can go back to Lady Catherine de Bourgh and tell her of his adventures that he's mingled
that
with.
Lady Catherine really loves Darcy, and she wants him as a son-in-law. She will want to know if he's met Darcy and how Darcy's doing, and if Darcy's interested in any ladies.
Ladies.
I think one of the big things that put us off Mr. Collins is his social climbing in different ways and his wanting to get that different status. And I think that is something that clergy are in danger of doing at different times. And I think there's people that we know, that we will not name because that's mean, who we see that trait in them and go, they're trying to introduce themselves to this person and this person in order to get that social standing. And there can be a bit of a race, isn't there, amongst clergy of those who want to be bishops. And actually those who are desperately striving to become bishops probably shouldn't become bishops. And there is a bit of, we're guilty of it because we are humans and we fail and we want power and influence and that kind of thing in different ways. And that's not necessarily a good thing for us all.
I believe that it was Jane Austen who said, and this sort of relates and sort of doesn't, that actually coming off the back of that, Ruthie, is that naturally as humans we are all very self-centered. Like, we want to thrive, we want to be held in high esteem. But I'm sure it was Jane Austen who said being self-centered or selfishness is the one sin that must always be forgiven in others, because it's the one thing that we can never avoid. Like, no one can avoid it. Now, I could be wrong. I will do my homework afterwards. I will do my research, but I'm sure it was her that said it.
Yeah.
I think you're talking about one of the Crawfords.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
Because that also honestly changed my life, because I find myself often being self-centered or selfish or thinking, and I'm like, oh, Jenny, how dare you think that? And then I think, actually, no, I would choose to have compassion on myself because of what she'd written.
There you go.
Exactly.
But don't be Mary Crawford. So to close off all that we've talked about today, I think the main question that we want to ask you is, are you Team Collins or not?
That's funny.
I may live to regret being so in defence of Mr. Collins, but right now, in this moment,
flag your fly with pride.
Separate, and I really want to encourage everyone, and I want to encourage you, Ruthie, to reread or rewatch. I think reading might be easier to do this. Reread Mr. Collins, Pride and Prejudice, if you want, as a whole. I'm going to do it as a whole. Trying to separate yourself from Elizabeth Bennet. We know the story is called Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Darcy's Pride and Elizabeth's Prejudice.
Prejudiced.
I think one of her prejudices that we see is how she views Mr. Collins. And I think it would be fascinating, and I think it is fascinating. I found it fascinating to try and separate this character from the perception of the character from whom all the description is coming.
Fine, I'll go read some more Jane Austen if I have to.
We always have set homework whenever we have these more spicy episodes with different interpretations of things.
Well, ladies, it's been a pleasure. And if we now retire to the drawing room, I believe there'll be it's time for tea. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Vicars Watch Dibley. Thank you to Toby for editing our ramblings.
Any views expressed in this podcast are our own and don't necessarily represent those of the Church of England or any other organisations with which we are affiliated.
And as always, bless you for listening.
Did you hear about the new British period drama?
No.
They're calling it Bloody Hell.
Very good.